Undercover Billionaire was saved by a black waitress at a coffee shop. What she exposed about him shocked everyone. She saved a stranger's life at 9:47 a.m. and destroyed her own heart by 6 p.m. the same day. The billionaire hiding in plain sight never expected salvation to come with a name tag and an apron. Marcus Rothwell had successfully disappeared from his family's assassination attempts until the day Keisha Williams made him remember what it felt like to be human. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the story. I have another beautiful story to share with you tomorrow, and I do not want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The man in the thrift store jacket ordered black coffee, like it was the last thing he'd ever taste. Marcus. No, he couldn't be Marcus here. Adjusted the worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and counted out exact change with hands that had forgotten the weight of coins. That'll be $3.50, the barista said without looking up, her attention already drifting to the next customer in line at Billionaire, the cramped coffee shop wedged between a laundromat and a check-cashing store on Chicago's South Side. He wasn't Marcus Rothwell III here, heir to a pharmaceutical empire worth $8 billion. Here, in this neighborhood where sirens punctuated conversations and hope felt rationed, he was just Mike, another face trying to disappear into the urban fabric. For 6 months, he'd been running from a world that had tried to kill him. Not literally, though the accident had been real enough. The betrayal, however, had cut deeper than any physical wound. Mike found his usual corner table, the one with the wobbling leg that matched his unsteady new life. Through the fingerprint-smudged window, he watched the morning rush, people clutching coffee like lifelines, heading to jobs that paid just enough to keep the lights on. These people didn't plot against family members or slip poison into trust funds. They simply survived, and in their honest struggle, he'd found something his penthouse had never offered: peace. The coffee was terrible. He loved it. Across the neighborhood, in a studio apartment where the radiator clanged symphonies and the walls were thin enough to share every neighbor's business, Keisha Williams was already running late. Again, she pulled her thick curls into a bun that would survive the morning rush, applied lip balm instead of the lipstick she couldn't afford to replace, and grabbed her jacket from the hook by the door. The jacket had seen better decades, but it was clean and it was hers. Two qualifications that mattered more than fashion in her world. At 28, Keisha had mastered the art of making something from nothing. Her smile could transform the dreariest morning into possibility. Her laugh could make regulars forget their troubles long enough to tip an extra $1. Her intuition could spot a person's real story from across a crowded room, even when they were trying desperately to hide it. Especially then. Morning, Keisha. Mrs. Patterson called from her stoop, already settled in for her daily neighborhood watch shift. You tell that manager of yours he better appreciate what he's got. I will, Mrs. P. Keisha called back, though they both knew her manager Jimmy barely noticed anything beyond the daily till count. That was fine. Keisha didn't work for Jimmy's approval. She worked because rent was due in 12 days and her community college classes wouldn't pay for themselves. The bell above Billionaire's door announced her arrival with its familiar broken chime. The morning light filtered through windows that hadn't seen proper cleaning in months, casting everything in a warm, forgiving glow that made even the cracked vinyl booths look almost charming. Thank God, muttered Tommy, the morning barista, already overwhelmed by the pre-work crowd. I've got 3 orders backed up and the espresso machine's making that noise again. Keisha tied her apron and surveyed her domain. The usual suspects occupied their regular spots. Mrs. Chun nursing a tea that would last 2 hours, the construction crew grabbing quick fuel before heading to whatever building was rising downtown, and the quiet man in the corner who'd become part of the furniture these past months. She'd noticed him that first day. Not because he was particularly handsome, though something about his careful posture suggested he might clean up well. Not because he seemed dangerous, though his eyes held the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. She'd noticed him because he looked lost in a way that had nothing to do with directions. Rich people had a different kind of lost, in her experience. They wandered through life like tourists in their own existence, never quite touching the ground. This man's lost felt deeper, more honest. Like he was trying to find something he'd never actually possessed. "Morning, Mike," she called out, already reaching for the regular coffee pot. 6 months of the same order had established their routine. He looked up, and for just a moment his guard dropped. "Morning, Keisha." That smile, brief but genuine, made her pause. There was something about the way he said her name, like it meant something. Like she meant something. In a world where most customers barely registered her as human, that small acknowledgement felt revolutionary. The morning rush began in earnest, transforming being there into controlled chaos. Keisha moved with practiced efficiency, taking orders, making change, remembering preferences, and somehow managing to make each interaction feel personal despite the pressure. This was her gift, making people feel seen. From his corner table, Mike watched her work. He'd spent years in boardrooms where people performed connection, where every smile calculated profit margins. Keisha's warmth was different, unfiltered, unstrategic, authentic in a way that made his chest tighten with something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. She caught him watching and raised an eyebrow in mock suspicion. "You planning to help or just provide commentary?" "Just admiring the artistry," he said, and meant it. The comment earned him a laugh that lit up her whole face. For a moment, the coffee shop felt like the center of something important, rather than a pit stop between better places. Neither of them knew that in less than an hour, a moment of crisis would strip away every carefully constructed wall between them, revealing truths that would change everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and what it meant to truly save someone. Sometimes our first impressions of people are shaped by the masks they wear rather than the truth they're hiding. What assumptions do we make about others based on appearances alone? The morning had settled into its familiar rhythm when the man with the knife walked through Billionaire's front door. Keisha noticed him immediately, not because of the blade hidden beneath his oversized coat, but because of his eyes. They darted frantically around the coffee shop like a cornered animal searching for escape routes that didn't exist. His hands shook as he approached the counter, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the October chill that clung to everyone else. "Can I help you?" Keisha asked, her voice carrying the same warmth she offered every customer, though something in her stomach twisted with unease. His voice cracked. "I need whatever's in the register." The words hung in the air for a heartbeat before their meaning crystallized. Keisha's training kicked in. Stay calm, comply, don't be a hero. These weren't just workplace rules. They were survival instincts learned in a neighborhood where desperation sometimes wore familiar faces. "Okay," she said softly, her hands moving slowly toward the register. "That's okay. We can do that." From his corner table, Mike's entire world shifted into sharp focus. Every instinct honed by years of corporate warfare screamed at him to stay seated, stay invisible, stay safe. He was supposed to be hiding, supposed to be protecting himself from the very real threats that had driven him to this neighborhood in the first place. But watching this young woman, this woman who had somehow become the brightest part of his carefully diminished world, face down a desperate man with nothing but grace and courage, something inside him broke open. The robber's attention was fixed entirely on Keisha and the register. His back was to the rest of the coffee shop, where the other customers had frozen in various states of shock and terror. Mrs. Chen clutched her purse. Tommy had disappeared behind the espresso machine. The construction workers looked ready to bolt. Mike stood up. The movement was fluid, quiet, born from instincts he'd forgotten he possessed. In his previous life, he'd been a weekend warrior, martial arts classes at an exclusive dojo, personal trainers who taught self-defense between stock tips. He'd never imagined needing those skills for anything more dangerous than boardroom politics. "Listen," Keisha was saying, her voice steady despite the tremor Mike could see in her hands. "Let me just open this for you, okay? There's no need for anyone to get hurt." The robber's grip tightened on the knife. "Faster." "I'm going as fast as I can," Keisha replied, her fingers working the register keys with deliberate precision. The system's a little slow in the mornings. Mike moved closer, using the natural chaos of overturned chairs and scattered customers as cover. He could see the man's profile now. Young, probably not much older than Keisha herself. His clothes hung loose on a frame that suggested missed meals, and his eyes held the hollow desperation of someone who'd run out of options. This wasn't a career criminal. This was someone's son, someone's brother, someone who'd reached the end of his rope in a world that didn't offer safety nets for the falling. The register drawer opened with a mechanical ding that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. "There," Keisha said, stepping back slightly. "Take what you need." What happened next unfolded in slow motion and lightning speed simultaneously. The robber reached across the counter, his attention focused entirely on the bills in the drawer. His grip on the knife loosened just enough. Mike moved. But instead of tackling the young man or trying to disarm him, Mike did something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to materialize from nowhere. "Hey, look at me." The robber spun around, knife raised, eyes wild with panic. "It's okay," Mike continued, his hands visible and empty. "Whatever's happening in your life right now, whatever brought you here, it doesn't have to end this way." "You don't know anything," the young man snarled, but his voice cracked with something that sounded suspiciously like relief at being seen as more than just a threat. "I know desperation," Mike said simply. "I know what it feels like when the world closes in and you can't see any way out except the wrong way." Keisha watched this exchange with growing amazement. The quiet man from the corner table, Mike, who ordered black coffee and left exact change, was speaking with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to defusing crises. His posture, his voice, even the way he held space in the room had transformed completely. "I know what it's like to have people who are supposed to care about you treat you like you're disposable," Mike continued, taking a small step closer. "I know how it feels when you realize you're completely alone." The knife wavered. "But you're not alone right now," Mike said. "And neither am I. Because we're all here together, trying to figure out how to make it through another day without losing the parts of ourselves that still matter." Keisha found herself holding her breath. Who was this man? Where had this version of Mike been hiding? "I can help," Mike said. "Not just with money, though I can help with that too, but with whatever brought you here. You don't have to do this alone." The young man's eyes filled with tears. The knife clattered to the floor. What followed was chaos of a different kind: police sirens, statements, phone calls. But through it all, Keisha kept watching Mike, seeing layers upon layers of mystery peeling away to reveal someone entirely different from the man she thought she knew. When the police finally left with the would-be robber, whose name was Jerome, who was 19, who was trying to pay for his sister's medicine, Mike and Keisha found themselves alone in the coffee shop, surrounded by overturned chairs and the aftermath of crisis. "So," Keisha said finally, studying his face with new eyes. "Black coffee, Mike, who always has exact change. Want to tell me who you really are?" Mike's hands trembled as he reached for his coffee cup, a delayed reaction to the adrenaline finally leaving his system. The question hung between them like smoke, visible, unavoidable, slowly filling every corner of the empty coffee shop. "I'm nobody special," he said, but even he could hear how hollow the words sounded after what had just happened. Nobody special didn't talk down armed robbers with the calm authority of someone who'd negotiated hostile takeovers. Nobody special didn't offer help with the casual confidence of unlimited resources. Keisha began righting the overturned chairs, her movements deliberate and measured. She'd seen enough people lie to recognize the signs: the way his eyes flickered to the left, how his shoulders tensed, the slight pause before each carefully chosen word. "Nobody special," she repeated, not quite a question. "Interesting. Because the Mike I thought I knew would have probably hidden under the table with everyone else. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It would have been the smart thing to do." Mike watched her work, noting how she moved with the same grace under pressure that had kept her calm during the robbery. Everything about Keisha was authentic, from her genuine concern for Jerome to the way she was giving him space to explain himself without pushing too hard. It made lying to her feel like sacrilege. "Maybe I surprised myself," he offered weakly. "Maybe." Keisha flipped the last chair and began wiping down tables that didn't really need cleaning. "Or maybe you're exactly who you've always been, and the rest of us just haven't been paying attention." The compliment hit harder than it should have. For 6 months, Mike had been invisible in this neighborhood, just another face in the crowd, another customer with simple needs. Being seen, really seen, felt simultaneously thrilling and, "Look," he started, then stopped. How could he explain that his real name was on Forbes lists and financial magazines? That his family's company employed thousands of people? That he'd walked away from more money than most people could imagine because staying meant risking his life? "I should probably get going," he said instead, reaching for his jacket. "Mike." Her voice stopped him cold. When he looked up, her dark eyes held a mixture of curiosity and something that looked suspiciously like disappointment. "That boy, Jerome. When you offered to help him, you meant it, didn't you?" The question caught him off guard. "Of course I meant it. So you can afford to help a stranger pay for his sister's medicine, but you count out exact change for coffee like every penny matters?" Damn. She was too smart, too observant. Mike felt the walls he'd carefully constructed over the past 6 months beginning to crack under the weight of her attention. "It's complicated," he said lamely. Keisha laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You know what's complicated? Working 3 jobs to pay for community college classes. Having your electricity shut off because you chose groceries over the light bill. Watching your neighbors choose between medicine and rent every month. That's complicated." Her words stung because they highlighted exactly what he'd been running from, the vast, unbridgeable gap between his reality and the reality of everyone around him. Even in hiding, even wearing thrift store clothes and living in a studio apartment, he couldn't escape the privilege that shaped every choice he'd ever made. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." "I don't want your apology," Keisha said, her voice sharper than he'd ever heard it. "I want your honesty. For 6 months, you've been coming in here, ordering the same coffee, sitting at the same table, acting like you belong in this neighborhood. But you don't, do you?" The accusation hit like a physical blow. You talk like someone who went to expensive schools. You move like someone who's never had to worry about taking up space. And today, when things got dangerous, you handled it like someone who's used to being in control." Mike's chest tightened. Every observation was accurate, every conclusion reasonable. But how could he explain that belonging here, in this small coffee shop with these genuine people, had become more important to him than any boardroom or country club he'd ever inhabited? "So what are you?" Keisha continued, her voice growing quieter but more intense. "Witness protection? Undercover cop? Rich boy playing at being poor?" The last guess was close enough to make him flinch visibly. "Ah." Keisha nodded slowly. "Rich boy it is." "It's not like that," Mike said desperately. "I mean it is, but it's not. I didn't come here to play at anything. I came here because—" He stopped himself before the words "my family tried to kill me" could escape. "Because what?" "Because I needed to disappear for a while." Keisha studied his face for a long moment. "From what?" Mike met her eyes, and for a heartbeat, he almost told her everything. About the board meeting where his own uncle had presented fabricated evidence of embezzlement. About the brakes on his car that had mysteriously failed on a mountain road. About the private investigator who'd warned him that staying meant dying. Instead, he said, "From people who wanted to hurt me." People like family? The guess was so accurate it felt like she'd reached inside his chest and squeezed his heart. Mike's silence was answer enough. Keisha sank into the chair across from him, her anger deflating into something sadder. "So you came here to hide among us poor folks where nobody would think to look for rich boy Mike." "It wasn't like that," he protested weakly, knowing it was exactly like that. "Wasn't it?" She shook her head. "You know what the worst part is? I actually started to care about you. The quiet guy in the corner who seemed lonely. The customer who always said please and thank you like he meant it. I thought." She trailed off, looking embarrassed. You thought what? I thought maybe you were someone I could trust. The words hit him like a physical blow. Trust. The one thing his money couldn't buy. The one thing his real world had systematically destroyed. And he'd found it here in this coffee shop with this extraordinary woman who saw through pretense like it was glass. And now he was losing it because he couldn't figure out how to tell the truth without losing everything else. The police tape stretched across Billionaire's entrance like a yellow scar, transforming the familiar coffee shop into a crime scene. Detective Morrison, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, flipped through her notepad as she addressed the small group gathered inside. I know this has been a long day for everyone, she said, glancing between Mike and Keisha. But we need detailed statements from both of you since you had the most direct interaction with the suspect. Mike shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Police meant official reports. Official reports meant names and addresses meant the possibility of being found by people who preferred him dead. But leaving now would only raise more questions he definitely couldn't answer. The thing is, Detective Morrison continued, Jerome's lawyer is claiming his client was coerced into the robbery attempt. Says someone threatened his family if he didn't get money fast. We need to understand exactly what each of you observed about his mental state. Keisha looked up sharply. Someone threatened his family? That's what he's saying. Could be true, could be a defense strategy. But if it's true, whoever coerced him might try to silence witnesses. The detective's matter-of-fact tone made the threat sound almost casual. So I'm recommending you both lay low for the next few days while we investigate. Lay low how? Keisha asked. Stay somewhere other than your usual addresses. Avoid predictable routines. We've seen cases where coercion rings target witnesses who might have overheard something useful. Mike felt the familiar ice-cold grip of paranoia settling over him. He'd been running from one threat for 6 months. Now there might be another. But looking at Keisha's worried face, he realized his own safety had suddenly become secondary to hers. I don't have anywhere else to go, Keisha said quietly. My apartment is all I've got. What about family? Friends? Detective Morrison asked. My grandmother lives in Atlanta. My closest friend moved to Seattle last year for work. Keisha's voice carried the particular loneliness of someone who'd built their life through sheer determination rather than family connections. Mike made a decision that surprised him with its immediacy. You can stay with me. Both women looked at him with varying degrees of shock. Mike, Keisha said carefully, we literally just had a conversation about how I don't know who you really are. Which is exactly why it makes sense, he replied, the logic crystallizing as he spoke. No one would look for either of us at my place. It's not connected to your regular life or routine, and it's... He paused, realizing he was about to reveal more than he intended. Detective Morrison raised an eyebrow. Secure how? Mike felt sweat prick his palms. Good locks. Safe neighborhood. It wasn't entirely a lie. The studio apartment he'd been renting did have good locks. Locks he'd had upgraded along with a security system that would have been overkill for most people in the neighborhood. But Detective Morrison seemed to accept the explanation. What do you think, Ms. Williams? The detective asked. Keisha stared at Mike for a long moment. He could practically see her weighing options. Trust the man who'd been lying to her for months, or go home alone to an apartment that might not be safe. Fine, she said finally. But only because I don't have a better choice. An hour later, they stood outside Mike's building as afternoon shadows stretched across the sidewalk. Keisha looked up at the modest 3-story structure with its fire escapes and small windows, trying to reconcile it with her growing suspicions about who Mike really was. This is it, she asked. This is it. Mike fumbled with his keys, suddenly self-conscious about bringing her into the space that had become his sanctuary. It's not much, but it's clean. The apartment was small but immaculately organized. Keisha noticed details immediately. The expensive laptop incongruously placed on a second-hand desk, the single photograph turned face down on the windowsill, the way Mike's few possessions were arranged with the precision of someone unused to living in small spaces. You can have the bed, Mike said, gesturing toward the studio's sleeping area. I'll take the couch. Mike. Keisha's voice was gentle but firm. We're going to be stuck here together for who knows how long. Maybe now would be a good time for that honesty conversation. Mike sank onto the couch, suddenly looking older than his 32 years. It's not that simple. Try me. He was quiet for so long that Keisha began to think he wouldn't answer. Then he reached for the face-down photograph on the windowsill and handed it to her. The image showed a younger version of Mike in an expensive suit, standing next to an older man in what looked like a corporate boardroom. They were both smiling, but Mike's smile looked strained, performative. That's my uncle, Mike said. Richard Rothwell. He ran our family's company with my father. Keisha's eyes widened as the pieces began clicking together. Rothwell. As in Rothwell Pharmaceuticals. Mike nodded miserably. As in the company currently being investigated by the FDA for price-fixing insulin. Oh my God. Keisha stared at the photograph, then at Mike. You're not just rich. You're pharmaceutical company rich. Mike corrected. I walked away. Or rather, I ran away. Same thing, I guess. Why? Mike looked out the window at the neighborhood he'd grown to love. The neighborhood where his family's business decisions affected real people like Mrs. Chun, who rationed her diabetes medication, and Jerome, who'd been desperate enough to rob a coffee shop for his sister's medical bills. Because they were killing people for profit, he said simply. And when I tried to stop them, they decided I was the problem that needed to be eliminated. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Outside, the neighborhood continued its evening rhythm. Children calling to each other, sirens in the distance, the ordinary sounds of people trying to survive another day. So you came here to hide, Keisha said finally. I came here to figure out how to live with myself, Mike replied. There's a difference. Keisha studied his face, seeing exhaustion and genuine remorse where she'd expected privilege and entitlement. And did you? Figure it out. Mike met her eyes. I thought I was starting to. Then today happened, and I realized I've just been hiding from the real work of making things right. What kind of real work? The kind that requires help from someone who actually understands this neighborhood. Someone who cares about people like Jerome and his sister. He paused. Someone like you. Outside, the first stars became visible against the darkening sky, and Keisha found herself looking at this man. This wealthy, complicated, frightened man with entirely new eyes. The laptop screen cast blue shadows across Mike's face as he scrolled through news articles, his fingers hesitating over headlines that made Keisha's stomach twist with recognition. Rothwell Pharmaceuticals under federal investigation. Insulin price increases leave diabetics choosing between food and medicine. Family company accused of monopolistic practices. This is why you left, Keisha said quietly, reading over his shoulder. It wasn't a question. This is why I should have left years earlier. Mike clicked on another article, this one featuring a photograph of a young girl holding a sign that read, "My insulin costs more than my mom's rent." Her name is Emma. She's 8 years old. Our company increased the price of her insulin by 400% in 2 years. Keisha sank into the chair beside him, processing the magnitude of what he was showing her. Your family did this? My uncle spearheaded it. My father went along with it. The board approved it unanimously. Mike's voice was hollow. Except for me. I was the only dissenting vote, which made me a problem. What did you do? Mike minimized the browser and opened a folder on his desktop labeled Evidence. Keisha's eyes widened as she saw dozens of files, internal emails, financial documents, recorded phone conversations. I started documenting everything. Price manipulation strategies, market cornering tactics, bribes to regulatory officials. I had enough evidence to bring down the entire executive team. He opened an audio file, and his uncle's voice filled the small apartment. The beauty is that diabetics can't exactly stop buying insulin. It's the perfect captive market. We could double the price tomorrow, and they'd still have to pay. Keisha's hands clenched into fists. She thought of her neighbor Mr. Jefferson, who'd started rationing his insulin, and ended up in the emergency room. She thought of Jerome, desperate enough to rob a coffee shop for his sister's medication. "Jesus, Mike," she whispered. "I was going to take it to the FBI." Mike continued, closing the file. "I had a meeting scheduled with a federal prosecutor. But somehow my uncle found out." "How?" Mike's laugh was bitter. "Family dinner. I should have known better than to trust anyone with the Rothwell name, but I thought my cousin David might help. Instead, he went straight to his father. And then the company hired the best lawyers money could buy to discredit me. Suddenly, I was a disgruntled heir with a drug problem and a gambling addiction, complete with falsified receipts from casinos and planted evidence in my apartment." Mike's hands shook slightly as he spoke. "They were building a case to have me declared mentally incompetent, which would have nullified my board position and my inheritance." Keisha reached for his hand without thinking, then pulled back when she realized what she'd done. But Mike caught her fingers, holding on like she was the only thing keeping him anchored. "That wasn't the worst part," he said. "The worst part was when my car's brakes failed on Highway 1. Pure coincidence, according to the police report. Mechanical failure on a brand new BMW. Oh my God, they tried to kill you." The private investigator I hired found evidence that the brake lines had been cut. But he also found evidence that wasn't the first attempt. "Remember that food poisoning that kept me out of the crucial board meeting? Turns out it was ricin poisoning. Not enough to kill me, just enough to keep me away when they voted to increase insulin prices again." Keisha stared at him, trying to process the reality of a family that would murder their own blood for profit. "So you ran." "I liquidated everything I could without raising suspicion, created a new identity, and disappeared. I've been sending anonymous payments to insulin advocacy groups, trying to help people afford their medication, but it feels like emptying the ocean with a teaspoon." "How much?" Keisha asked suddenly. "How much what? How much have you sent to help people?" Mike hesitated. "About 12 million so far." The number hung in the air between them. $12 million. More money than Keisha could realistically imagine. And he said it like it wasn't nearly enough. "That's why you offered to help Jerome," she realized. "You've been helping people like him all along. People like Jerome exist because of my family. Because I didn't fight hard enough, fast enough." Mike released her hand and stood up, pacing to the window. "Do you know what the worst part is? I convinced myself that hiding here, living quietly, sending anonymous money, I convinced myself that was enough. That I was doing good. You were doing good. I was hiding from responsibility." Mike turned to face her. "Today, when I saw that boy with the knife, when I saw you handling it with more courage than I've shown in 6 months, I realized I've been lying to myself about what heroism looks like." Keisha stood up, moving closer to him. "What does it look like?" "It looks like you, standing there calmly counting out money for a desperate kid while he's holding a weapon. It looks like Mrs. Patterson looking out for her neighbors every day. It looks like Jerome risking everything for his sister." Mike's voice cracked slightly. "It doesn't look like a coward sending anonymous checks from a studio apartment. You're not a coward, Mike. You walked away from billions of dollars because it was the right thing to do. I walked away because staying was dangerous. That's not the same thing, isn't it?" Keisha stepped closer, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes. "You could have taken the money and kept quiet. You could have moved to some island somewhere and lived like a king while people died from rationing insulin. But you didn't. I should have stayed and fought. You should have stayed and died, more likely." Keisha's voice was fierce now. "And then who would have helped all those families? Who would have saved Jerome today?" Mike looked at her with something that might have been wonder. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Make me feel like maybe I'm not completely worthless." The vulnerability in his voice broke something open in Keisha's chest. This wasn't the confident man who'd talked down an armed robber. This wasn't even the mysterious customer who'd intrigued her for months. This was someone who'd lost everything, family, identity, home, because he'd chosen conscience over comfort. "You're not worthless, Marcus," she said gently, using his real name for the first time. "Keisha," he whispered, and the way he said her name sounded like a prayer. The space between them seemed to shrink, charged with the electricity of shared secrets and growing understanding. For the first time since he'd walked into being there 6 months ago, Mike felt like someone truly saw him. Not the heir, not the exile, not the hero or the coward, but simply the man trying to figure out how to live with the weight of his choices. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its evening rhythm, unaware that two people in a small apartment were discovering that sometimes salvation comes not from grand gestures, but from the simple act of being witnessed in all your broken, complicated humanity. The takeout containers sat empty between them on the small table, the remnants of Thai food from the restaurant down the street, a meal that had somehow stretched into 3 hours of conversation. Mike had insisted on ordering from every place that delivered to the neighborhood, as if making up for months of carefully rationed coffee purchases. "You don't have to feed me like I'm a stray cat," Keisha had said when the second delivery arrived, but she was laughing when she said it. "I'm not," Mike replied, unpacking containers with the enthusiasm of someone rediscovering joy in simple pleasures. "I'm celebrating." "Celebrating what?" "The first honest conversation I've had in 6 months." Now, as evening light filtered through the apartment's single window, Keisha found herself studying Marcus. She'd started thinking of him by his real name, with new eyes. Without the weight of deception between them, he seemed lighter somehow, younger. The careful tension that had always marked his movements had eased into something more natural. "Can I ask you something?" she said, curling up in the corner of the couch. "Haven't you been asking me things all day? This is different." She hesitated, then forged ahead. "When you were growing up, were you happy?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Happy? I don't know. I never really thought about happiness as something I was supposed to achieve. I was supposed to be successful, profitable, useful to the company. That's not what I asked." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "There was this groundskeeper at our estate when I was maybe 10. His name was Luis. He taught me how to plant tomatoes in the kitchen garden. Not because it was educational or character building, but because he genuinely loved watching things grow." Keisha waited, sensing there was more. "My father found out and fired him. Said the help wasn't paid to socialize with family members. I never saw Luis again, but every summer after that, I'd sneak out to the kitchen garden and try to grow tomatoes by myself." Marcus smiled sadly. "They never grew right. I didn't know what I was doing without him." "You were 10 years old, Marcus. You weren't supposed to know. My family didn't see it that way. Rothwells were supposed to be born knowing how to command, how to lead, how to extract maximum value from every situation. Needing help was weakness. Caring about the help was worse." Keisha felt something twist in her chest. Not pity, but a fierce protectiveness for the lonely child he'd been. "Is that why you never learned to connect with people?" "I learned to perform connection. It's different." Marcus looked at her directly. "Until I met you, I didn't know the difference." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest. Keisha felt her carefully maintained emotional distance beginning to crumble. "My turn," Marcus said. "What made you so fearless today?" Most people would have been terrified facing down Jerome. "I was terrified," Keisha corrected. "But Jerome wasn't the first desperate person I've encountered. Growing up in this neighborhood, you learn to see past the surface. That boy wasn't a criminal. He was someone's baby brother making a terrible choice because he couldn't see any other options." "How did you know?" "The way he kept apologizing under his breath. Real criminals don't apologize, they justify. And his hands were shaking too much for someone who'd done this before." Keisha pulled her knees up to her chest. "Plus, I recognized him. You knew him. I knew his sister. Talia used to come into being there sometimes before her condition got worse. Sweet girl, maybe 16. She'd order hot chocolate and do homework in the corner booth." Keisha's voice softened. "She stopped coming about 2 months ago. I wondered what happened." Marcus stared at her. "You recognize the connection immediately. That's what you do in a real community. You pay attention to each other. You notice when someone disappears." She gave him a meaningful look. You notice when someone new shows up, too. Is that why you were so kind to me? Because you noticed I was alone. Keisha considered the question seriously. At first, maybe. You had this look, like you were hungry for something that wasn't food. But then you started really listening when people talked. You remembered Mrs. Chen's tea preference. You always said thank you to Tommy, even when he screwed up your order. Small things, but they mattered. They were the first real interactions I'd had with people in years, Marcus admitted. In my old life, conversations were transactions. People wanted something from me, or I wanted something from them. But at being there, you just talked to me. Like I was a person instead of a resource. You are a person, Marcus. A good person who made hard choices. Am I? Sometimes I wonder if I'm just a coward who ran away when things got difficult. Keisha shifted closer to him on the couch. You want to know what I think? I'm not sure I'm ready for your honesty, he said, but he was smiling. I think you're someone who had the courage to walk away from everything you'd ever known because your conscience wouldn't let you stay. I think you're someone who's been punishing himself for not being perfect instead of recognizing that he's been doing the best he could with impossible circumstances. Marcus looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. How do you do that? Do what? Make me feel like maybe I deserve forgiveness. Because you do, Marcus. You've been carrying guilt that belongs to other people. Your uncle, your father, the board members who voted for those price increases, they made those choices. You were just one voice trying to stop them. One voice that failed. One voice that's still fighting, even in exile. $12 million in anonymous donations, remember? You think that didn't save lives. For the first time since she'd known him, Marcus's smile reached his eyes. You have a very generous interpretation of my character. I have an accurate interpretation of your character. The question is whether you're ready to see yourself clearly. The apartment had grown dark around them while they talked, the only light coming from the laptop screen and the street lamps outside. In the intimate dimness, the walls between them seemed to dissolve completely. Keisha, Marcus said quietly, I need to tell you something else. More secrets. Not a secret. A truth. He turned to face her fully. These past 6 months, watching you work, talking with you, being part of this community, it's been the most honest I've ever felt in my life. And today, seeing your courage, your compassion, the way you saw Jerome as a person instead of just a threat, I realized something. What's that? I'm falling in love with you, he said simply. And that terrifies me more than my uncle, more than the FBI investigation, more than anything I've ever faced. The confession settled between them like a bridge, beautiful, necessary, and impossible to uncross. The knock on the door came at 6:47 a.m., sharp and insistent. Keisha jolted awake on the couch where she'd fallen asleep during their late-night conversation, her neck stiff from the awkward angle. Marcus was already sitting up in bed, his body coiled with the hypervigilance of someone who'd learned to expect the worst. Police, a voice called through the door. We need to speak with Marcus Rothwell. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Marcus's carefully constructed world, 6 months of anonymity, of safety, of belonging, crumbled in an instant. Keisha saw the exact moment hope died in his eyes. How did they find you? She whispered. Marcus was already moving, pulling on clothes with mechanical efficiency. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're not involved in whatever happens next. Marcus, open up, Mr. Rothwell. We know you're in there. More knocking, more urgent now. Through the thin walls, Keisha could hear neighbors stirring, voices murmuring about police cars in the street. The quiet life Marcus had built was about to become a very public spectacle. Marcus opened the door to find Detective Morrison standing beside a man in an expensive suit who looked like an older, harder version of Marcus himself. Uncle Richard, Marcus said, his voice flat. I should have known. Richard Rothwell smiled, but it never reached his eyes. Hello, nephew. You've led us quite a chase. Mr. Rothwell, Detective Morrison said, we need you to come with us for questioning. There's been a development in the Jerome Williams case. Keisha's blood ran cold. Williams? As in the young man who attempted to rob the coffee shop yesterday, Richard said smoothly. Apparently, there are some inconsistencies in his story. He's now claiming that the robbery was staged, that he was paid to create a distraction. That's impossible, Keisha said immediately. Jerome was desperate. You could see it in his eyes, in his hands. Could you? Richard's gaze shifted to her with calculating coldness. Or did you see what someone wanted you to see? Someone who perhaps needed to appear heroic in front of a young woman he was hoping to impress. The implication hit Keisha like a physical blow. She turned to stare at Marcus, searching his face for immediate denial, for outrage at the accusation. Instead, she saw guilt. Marcus, she said slowly, tell them it's not true. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. The thing is, Richard continued conversationally, Marcus has always had a flair for the dramatic. Even as a child, he staged elaborate scenarios to get attention. Remember the time you convinced the staff you'd been kidnapped, Marcus? Had everyone searching the grounds for hours while you hid in the wine cellar. I was 8, Marcus said quietly. Age is irrelevant when discussing character patterns, Richard replied. The FBI will be very interested to learn that their key witness in the insulin price-fixing case has a history of manufacturing crises for personal gain. Keisha felt the world tilting beneath her feet. Manufacturing crises? Tell her, Marcus, Richard said, his voice gentle as poisoned honey. Tell her about the other heroic rescues. The woman you pulled from the burning building that mysteriously caught fire right after you walked by. The child who nearly drowned in the fountain at your country club. Such a coincidence that you were the only one close enough to help. Stop, Marcus whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. Or perhaps she'd like to know about the insulin patients you've been helping with anonymous donations. All carefully documented, of course, for maximum tax benefit and public sympathy when the story inevitably comes out. Each revelation struck Keisha like a slap. She thought of their conversation last night, his confession of love, the way he'd made her feel seen and valued. Had it all been performance? Another staged crisis designed to win her sympathy? The donations were real, Marcus said desperately, looking at Keisha. The people I helped, they were real. But the motivations? Richard smiled. The FBI has financial records showing that Marcus has been building a case for clemency based on his charitable work. Every donation tracked, every recipient documented. It's quite sophisticated, really. Detective Morrison cleared her throat. Mr. Rothwell, we need you to come with us. Questions have been raised about your credibility as a witness. And the young woman here, Richard said, turning his cold smile on Keisha, will need to be questioned about her role in yesterday's staged incident. My role? Keisha's voice cracked. I didn't have a role. I was working. She stopped, suddenly seeing the past 6 months through new eyes. The regular customer who always sat in the corner, always watching her. The man who showed up during her shifts, learned her schedule, positioned himself to be her rescuer. Oh God, she whispered. It was all planned, wasn't it? The coffee shop, the timing, everything. Keisha, no, Marcus started, but she was already backing away from him. You picked me, she said, her voice growing stronger and more furious with each word. You studied this neighborhood, found the perfect working-class black woman to play the role of grateful victim in your redemption story. That's not. Don't you dare lie to me again. The words exploded out of her. 6 months of lies, Marcus. 6 months of making me believe you were just a lonely man who needed kindness. But you were casting me in your performance, weren't you? Marcus reached for her, but she jerked away from his touch. How much of it was real? She demanded. Any of it? Or was I just another prop in your elaborate staged heroism? All of it was real, Marcus said desperately. My feelings for you, my respect for this community, the way you changed how I see everything, that was all real. But built on lies, Keisha said, tears streaming down her face. Built on manipulation and deception, and using me as your token poor black friend to prove you're not the monster your family says you are. Richard watched the destruction of his nephew's carefully built life with visible satisfaction. Shall we go, Marcus? I believe you've done enough damage here. Marcus looked at Keisha one last time, his face crumpling with the weight of losing the only real thing in his life. I love you, he said quietly. That part was never fake. Love. Keisha's laugh was bitter and broken. You don't even know what love means. Love requires honesty, requires seeing someone as an equal instead of as a useful prop in your personal drama. She turned away from him, wrapping her arms around herself like armor. Get out of my neighborhood, Marcus. Go back to your real world where everything can be bought and everyone can be used. The door closed behind Marcus and the police with a finality that echoed through the small apartment. Keisha stood alone in the space that had briefly felt like sanctuary, surrounded by the remains of takeout containers and the lingering scent of a trust that would never be rebuilt. Outside, she could hear car doors slamming, engines starting, the sound of Marcus Rothwell disappearing from her life as suddenly as he'd entered it, leaving behind only the devastating knowledge that sometimes the people who save you are the same ones who destroy you. The downtown police station felt like a tomb made of fluorescent lights and stale coffee. Marcus sat in interview room C, his hands cuffed to a metal table, staring at the two-way mirror that reflected a man he barely recognized. 3 days of interrogation had stripped away the last remnants of his carefully constructed anonymity, leaving only Marcus Rothwell III, heir, exile, fool. Detective Morrison sat across from him, her expression unreadable as she flipped through a thick file folder. Your uncle's story is compelling, she said without looking up. Rich boy stages heroic incidents to rehabilitate his image before testifying against his family. Makes sense from a psychological perspective. It makes sense because Richard is a master manipulator who's had 3 days to craft a narrative, Marcus replied, his voice hoarse from hours of questioning. But it's not true. Then explain the financial records. Explain the patterns. Explain why every one of your spontaneous heroic acts was perfectly positioned to be witnessed and documented. Marcus closed his eyes, seeing Keisha's face when she looked at him with such devastating disappointment. I can't explain the patterns because I never looked for them. I was just trying to help people. People who all happen to be potential character witnesses for your upcoming testimony. People who needed help. Marcus opened his eyes, meeting the detective's gaze. Do you want to know the real truth? The truth my uncle doesn't want anyone to hear. Detective Morrison leaned back in her chair. I'm listening. The reason I can't explain the patterns is because I've been running scared for 6 months. I chose that neighborhood because it felt safe, not because I was hunting for heroic opportunities. I chose being there because Keisha made the best coffee I'd had in years, and because she smiled at me like I was worth something. And the donations were guilt money, pure and simple. Every dollar I sent to insulin advocacy groups was my pathetic attempt to balance the scales for what my family had done. Marcus leaned forward as much as the cuffs would allow. But you want to know something interesting? Richard couldn't have known about those donations unless someone in law enforcement told him. Detective Morrison's eyes sharpened. What are you implying? I'm stating a fact. Those financial records were sealed as part of the federal investigation. The only way Richard could access them is if someone in the FBI or the prosecutor's office is feeding him information. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. Richard didn't find me through investigative work. He was tipped off the moment your department ran my real name through the system after the robbery incident. Detective Morrison was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. If what you're saying is true, then my uncle has corrupted federal law enforcement the same way he corrupted insulin pricing, with money and influence and the kind of systemic power that makes justice optional for people like him. The interview room door opened, and Richard Rothwell entered with the confident stride of a man accustomed to controlling every room he walked into. Behind him trailed a lawyer who looked expensive enough to buy small countries. I think that's enough questioning for now, the lawyer said smoothly. My client is clearly distraught and making wild accusations. Your client? Detective Morrison looked confused. I thought you were representing Mr. Marcus Rothwell. Richard smiled. There's been a misunderstanding. I'm here to take my nephew home. The family has decided to handle this matter privately. Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. I'm not going anywhere. You are actually, the lawyer said, producing official-looking documents. Your father has initiated competency proceedings. Given your recent erratic behavior, living in squalor, associating with criminals, staging elaborate hoaxes, the family has petitioned for guardianship. Guardianship? Marcus stared at the papers in horror. I'm 32 years old, and clearly suffering from a breakdown that's left you unable to make rational decisions, Richard said with mock concern. Don't worry, nephew. We'll take good care of you. Private facility, excellent doctors, complete rest from the stresses that have obviously overwhelmed you. Marcus understood with crystal clarity that he was looking at his death sentence. A private facility where accidents happened, where mentally incompetent heirs could die quietly of natural causes while their families mourned publicly and inherited billions privately. Detective Morrison, Marcus said urgently, don't let them take me. Once I'm in their custody, I'll never make it to testify against them. Your nephew is clearly paranoid, the lawyer said smoothly. Another symptom of his deteriorating mental state. Detective Morrison looked between Marcus and his uncle, her instincts clearly warring with the legal documents being waved in her face. Please, Marcus said quietly. Just give me one phone call. One call to verify what I'm telling you about the leaked information. He's had his phone calls, Richard said firmly. It's time to go home, Marcus. I want to call Keisha Williams, Marcus said desperately. She's the only person who knows the truth about who I really am. Richard's mask slipped slightly. The woman has made it quite clear she wants nothing to do with you. Rather cruel, actually, the way she rejected you when your true nature was revealed. The words hit Marcus like physical blows, but they also crystallized something important. Keisha had rejected the lies, the manipulation, the performance. But she'd also seen something in him worth saving, worth believing in, worth loving, even if she could no longer trust it. She rejected the version of me you presented to her, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. But she fell in love with the man I actually am underneath all the fear and deception. A touching delusion, Richard said coldly. A truth that terrifies you, Marcus replied, because it means someone saw past your family's poison and found something worth redemption. Detective Morrison made a decision. One phone call, she said firmly. Then we'll discuss next steps. As she led Marcus toward the phone, he realized this might be his only chance. Not just to save himself, but to save the investigation that could prevent thousands of people from dying while his family profited from their desperation. But first, he had to convince the woman whose heart he'd broken that the man she'd fallen in love with was real, even if everything else had been a lie. The phone felt impossibly heavy in his hands as he dialed the number for Billionaire, praying that Keisha would be working, praying that she would answer, praying that love could survive the weight of devastating truth. The phone rang 4 times before Keisha's voice answered, professional and distant. Billionaire Coffee, this is Keisha. Don't hang up, Marcus said quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. Please. The silence stretched so long he thought she'd disconnected. Then, you have 60 seconds. Richard is here. He's trying to have me declared incompetent, so he can put me in a private facility. If I go with him, I'll never make it to the federal trial. The words tumbled out in a desperate rush. But that's not why I called. Then why did you call, Marcus? The way she said his name, careful, guarded, like handling broken glass, nearly broke his resolve. Because you were right about everything. About the lies, about the manipulation, about me using you as a prop in my redemption story. All of it was true. He heard her sharp intake of breath, could picture her gripping the phone tighter. But you were wrong about one thing, Marcus continued. You said I don't know what love means. That love requires seeing someone as an equal instead of a useful prop. He paused, gathering the courage for complete honesty. You taught me what love means, Keisha. Not through what you gave me, but through what you demanded from me. Marcus, you demanded truth when I offered performance. You demanded authenticity when I offered manipulation. You demanded that I see you as a whole person instead of a salvation project. His voice cracked. And even when I failed at all of that, you still saw something in me worth saving. Through the phone, he could hear the familiar sounds of being there. The espresso machine's hiss, the bell over the door, the ordinary rhythms of a life continuing without him. What do you want from me? Keisha asked finally. I want you to know that the man you fell in love with was real. Buried under years of fear and manipulation and survival tactics, but real. Marcus gripped the phone tighter. And I want you to know that if I don't make it out of this, it won't be because I was a coward. It will be because I finally learned how to be brave enough to tell the truth. Detective Morrison appeared in the doorway, tapping her watch impatiently. Behind her, Marcus could see Richard pacing, his expensive lawyer checking his phone with barely concealed frustration. They're coming for me, Marcus said. But before I go, I need to tell you something else. The federal prosecutor has copies of all my evidence, emails, recordings, financial documents proving the insulin price fixing. If something happens to me, make sure she gets them to the right people. What are you talking about? There's a storage unit. Number 247 at Secure Space on MLK Boulevard. The key is taped under the sink in my apartment. Marcus spoke quickly, aware his time was running out. Everything's in there. Evidence that could save thousands of lives by stopping my family's monopolistic practices. Marcus, you're scaring me. Good. Because this is scary. But it's also the first completely honest thing I've done in months. He took a shaky breath. I love you, Keisha Williams. Not because you saved me, but because you saw me clearly enough to demand that I save myself. The line went quiet except for the distant sounds of the coffee shop. When Keisha spoke again, her voice was barely audible. The man who talked down Jerome, she said slowly. The man who offered to help without being asked. The man who remembered Mrs. Chen's tea order and always said thank you to Tommy. That man was real. That man was more real than I'd ever been in my entire life. Then prove it. The words hit him like an electric shock. What? If that man was real, then fight for him. Don't let your uncle win. Don't let them silence you. Keisha's voice grew stronger, more determined. That storage unit you mentioned? I'm going there right now. And I'm calling every news outlet, every advocacy group, every person who's been hurt by insulin price fixing. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly, but something fiercer. Purpose. Keisha, that's dangerous. If Richard finds out, then he'll learn that this neighborhood protects its own. And like it or not, Marcus Rothwell, you became one of us the day you chose conscience over comfort. Detective Morrison stepped into the room, followed by Richard and his lawyer. Time's up, she said firmly. Keisha, Marcus said quickly. I heard you, she interrupted. And Marcus? The man I fell in love with? He would have made this choice 6 months ago if he hadn't been so scared. But better late than never. The line went dead, but Marcus found himself smiling for the first time in days. Ready to go home, nephew? Richard asked, his voice silky with false concern. Marcus looked at his uncle, really looked at him, and saw not the intimidating patriarch who'd controlled his life for 32 years, but a small, frightened man whose power depended entirely on other people's silence. I'm not going anywhere with you, Marcus said clearly. Detective Morrison, I'm formally requesting protective custody pending my testimony in the federal case against Rothwell Pharmaceuticals. Richard's composed mask finally cracked. You ungrateful. I'm grateful, Marcus interrupted. Grateful for Keisha Williams, who taught me that love means demanding the best from each other. Grateful for this neighborhood, which showed me what community actually looks like. And grateful for the chance to finally stop my family from killing people for profit. The lawyer stepped forward with his documents. Mr. Rothwell, you're clearly not competent to make these decisions. Actually, Detective Morrison said, pulling out her own phone, I just received some very interesting information about leaked federal investigation details. Mr. Marcus Rothwell, you're under federal protection as of right now. 3 hours later, Marcus sat in a different kind of room. This one with windows, comfortable chairs, and a federal prosecutor who listened with growing amazement as he detailed years of evidence against his family's company. But his attention kept drifting to his phone, where text messages from Keisha updated him on her progress. Storage unit secured. Mrs. Patterson is standing guard with her neighborhood watch crew. Channel 7 News wants an interview. Should I tell them about Jerome's sister? The insulin advocacy groups are calling this the breakthrough they've been waiting for. You did it, Marcus. You actually did it. The final message came as the sun was setting over Chicago, painting the federal building's windows gold. When this is over, we need to talk. Really talk. About truth and trust, and what it means to build something real together. But Marcus? That man I fell in love with? He's a hero. Not because he saves people, but because he's finally brave enough to save himself. Marcus smiled, looking out at the city where Keisha Williams was probably closing bean there for the night, where Mrs. Patterson was settling in for neighborhood watch duty, where Jerome's sister would soon have access to affordable insulin thanks to the federal investigation that would reshape pharmaceutical pricing forever. For the first time in his life, Marcus Rothwell knew exactly who he was and where he belonged. Not in penthouses or private facilities, but in the messy, complicated, beautiful world of people who chose each other every day, who demanded honesty even when it hurt, who understood that real love wasn't about salvation, but about the courage to keep showing up, telling the truth, and building something better together. The undercover billionaire was finally ready to come home. Sometimes the greatest act of love is demanding that someone become their best self, even when it's painful for both of you. What relationships in your life have challenged you to grow beyond who you thought you were?